The false accusation. It was a peaceful evening in the small suburban neighborhood of Maple Ridge. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. Children still played outside, their laughter and shouts echoing through the quiet neighborhood. Among them was 13-year-old Liam, a boy known for his friendly nature and love for sports. He kicked a soccer ball with his friends in the cul-de-sac, a carefree smile on his face as he tried to show off a new trick he had learned. The neighborhood felt like a safe, familiar place where everyone knew each other. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. A sudden crack of glass rang through the air as a rock struck the windshield of a passing patrol car, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. Officer Raymond Barnes, a 12-year veteran on the force, was driving home after a long and tiring shift. The rock had come out of nowhere, and his tiredness quickly turned into an overwhelming surge of anger. Slamming on the brakes, Officer Barnes jumped out of his car, scanning the area for the culprit. He was furious. This wasn't just some random act. It was an attack on his property, an assault on his safety. Standing nearby, playing soccer with his friends, was Liam. Without giving it a second thought, Officer Barnes marched over to the group of children, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. His anger was palpable, his face turning beet red as he approached Liam. The boy was still holding the soccer ball, his expression shifting from joy to confusion as the officer stood before him. "Did you just throw that rock at my car?" Officer Barnes demanded, pointing a finger directly at Liam. Liam's heart skipped a beat. He didn't even know what was going on. "No, sir, I didn't do anything," he stammered, his voice quivering with uncertainty. He couldn't comprehend why he was being accused of something he hadn't done. The officer's face twisted with fury. "Don't lie to me," he shouted, grabbing the boy by the arm so tightly that it made Liam wince. "You're coming with me." Liam's friends stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. They couldn't believe what was happening. His parents, hearing the commotion, rushed out of the house in panic. His mother, Sarah, ran to the officer, her hands trembling as she tried to reason with him. "Please, officer, he's just a boy. He was playing soccer with his friends. He wouldn't do something like that," Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking with emotion. But Officer Barnes wasn't listening. His mind was clouded with anger, and he was determined to make someone pay for the damage to his car. Without hesitation, he called for backup, and within moments, another officer arrived on the scene. They handcuffed Liam and threw him into the back of the squad car. His mother's cries echoed in the night, but it was no use. The officer's mind was made up. Liam was arrested. As the car drove away, Liam looked out of the window, still in disbelief. How had his life turned upside down in an instant? He had done nothing wrong, but the world was already treating him like a criminal. And the worst part, it wasn't just anyone accusing him. It was a police officer, someone people were supposed to trust. The courtroom battle. The days following Liam's arrest passed in a blur of confusion and dread. The night he was taken away in handcuffs felt like it was happening to someone else. The charges hanging over him were surreal, and the idea that his life had been turned upside down by a false accusation was something he couldn't quite grasp. But he knew this was real. It was happening. And now, all he had were his family, his lawyer, and his own belief in the truth to fight for his innocence. The morning of the trial, the family sat in the sterile, cold courtroom, the atmosphere thick with tension. Liam had never been in a courtroom before, and the intimidating surroundings made his stomach churn. His lawyer, Rachel Adams, was a woman of great poise, her sharp mind evident in the way she handled herself. She had assured them that she would fight for him. But even then, the weight of the unknown was a lot to bear. The courtroom was buzzing with activity as the bailiff called the room to order. The judge, an older man with a graying beard and glasses perched on his nose, called everyone to attention. The judge's gavel echoed through the room, and the trial officially began. Liam's parents, Sarah and Mark, sat behind him, their hands tightly clasped together. their expressions grim but hopeful. The prosecutor stood first, his movements deliberate and controlled. He was a seasoned attorney, someone who had handled dozens of cases like this before. With a confident stride, he approached the judge, preparing to lay out the case against Liam. "We are here today because of the actions of the defendant, Liam Harris," the prosecutor began, his voice cold but commanding. "The evidence is clear. Officer Raymond Barnes, a man of integrity who serves this community, witnessed the defendant throwing a rock at his patrol car. He was enraged by this unprovoked act, and it is his word against the word of a boy who was only 13. Liam could feel his chest tighten as the prosecutor's words landed heavily. The man's words painted a clear image of guilt in the eyes of the jury. It was a simple narrative, one that would likely stick with them through the trial. He wanted to stand up, to shout that it wasn't true, but the weight of the accusation kept him rooted to his seat. There was nothing simple about the truth in this case. His truth was complicated, messy, and now it seemed to be the only thing standing between him and a life marked by something he hadn't done. Officer Barnes, the prosecutor continued, will testify that he saw the defendant throw the rock, and the damage to his vehicle supports that claim. We also have additional witnesses who saw the defendant in the vicinity of the incident. This is not a matter of doubt. We have a clear case of vandalism and defiance of authority." The words hit Liam like a punch to the stomach. Vandalism, defiance of authority. To him, those words didn't even feel like they belonged in the same sentence with his name. He was a kid, someone who had spent his days playing soccer and enjoying his neighborhood, not plotting some kind of attack on an officer's car. But those words, spoken with such confidence and authority, were now part of the case against him. Rachel Adams, the defense attorney, stood up next, her voice steady as she addressed the judge and jury. She was calm, composed, and there was a quiet intensity to the way she presented herself. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we are here today because a young boy has been accused of a crime he did not commit. Liam Harris stands before you, accused of an act he did not do. I ask you, with all due respect, to look carefully at the facts before you. What we have here is an accusation based on a single individual's testimony, with no concrete evidence linking Liam to the crime." Rachel's words immediately filled the courtroom with a different kind of energy. She wasn't angry, nor was she defensive. She was measured, calculating. She painted a picture of doubt in the minds of the jury, who began shifting in their seats. Liam could see some of them exchange glances as Rachel continued. "There is no physical evidence that proves Liam threw that rock," she stated firmly. "No fingerprints, no trace of the rock, no surveillance footage, no confession. We are left with the word of a police officer who, it seems, may have been mistaken in his identification of the suspect." Liam's heart fluttered with hope. Maybe Rachel's words would be the key to unlocking his freedom. But he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The prosecutor was a seasoned adversary, and he had already set the stage for the jury to believe that Liam was guilty. But Rachel was determined. She wasn't going to let this case slip away based on assumptions and biases. Rachel Adams went on to address Officer Barnes. She carefully questioned the officer's recollection of the event, pointing out the lack of evidence that linked Liam to the incident. "Officer Barnes," Rachel began, her voice measured, "you stated that you saw Liam throw the rock at your car. But did you stop to ask anyone else if they saw anything? Did you consider the possibility that you could have been mistaken, especially considering the chaos of the moment?" Officer Barnes stiffened but did not back down. "I saw him. I know what I saw. The boy was right there, and he was the only one near my car." Rachel nodded, allowing a moment of silence to pass before speaking again. "But Officer Barnes, you didn't stop to check the area before making an arrest. You didn't take a moment to verify your claim, did you?" Barnes faltered for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. I was angry. The damage to my car was significant, and I didn't think about it in the moment. I just reacted." Rachel's eyes never left the officer as she spoke. "Exactly. You reacted in anger, and in that moment, you made a snap judgment. But that judgment, without verifying the facts, led to the arrest of an innocent boy. The room grew quiet as Rachel's words settled in. The jury was listening, and Liam could feel their eyes shift as they began to process the inconsistencies in Officer Barnes' story. But the battle wasn't won yet. The prosecutor would certainly respond with counterarguments to try and discredit Rachel's points. The prosecutor quickly rose to his feet, eager to attack the defense's narrative. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is attempting to undermine the officer's testimony. Officer Barnes is a respected member of this community, and his years of experience cannot be discounted just because of a single moment of frustration. The judge nodded, but Rachel remained unfazed. I'm not questioning Officer Barnes' integrity, she said calmly. I'm merely highlighting that, in the heat of the moment, he might have been mistaken. His credibility is not the issue here. The issue is whether or not Liam Harris committed the crime he is accused of. The tension in the room was thick, and it felt like the very air was heavy with anticipation. Liam's nerves were on edge, but Rachel's calm demeanor and unwavering belief in his innocence were a source of strength. She wasn't just defending him. She was fighting for the truth. As the questioning continued, the defense called their own set of witnesses. Liam's friends, who had been playing with him that evening, were asked to testify. They described the scene as they had witnessed it, providing an alternate account that contradicted the prosecution's version of events. Jake, Liam's best friend, was called to the stand, and his testimony provided a critical turning point. I was there, Jake said, his voice shaking slightly. We were playing soccer. Liam didn't throw any rock. It wasn't him. We saw someone else. Someone else was standing near the street when the rock hit the car. It wasn't Liam. We were all there together. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The defense had finally introduced doubt, and the once unwavering certainty in the prosecutor's case was now being questioned. The story had shifted, but the prosecutor wasn't ready to give up. He cross-examined Jake with a series of tough questions, trying to discredit his account. However, Jake's testimony had already planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the jury. The tension was palpable. As the day wore on, Liam couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. For the first time since the accusation, he felt like someone believed him. Rachel's determination, Jake's honest testimony, and the cracks in Officer Barnes' story had created the opportunity for the truth to come to light. The jury would deliberate soon, and Liam's future would hang in the balance. But one thing was certain: he was no longer going to accept the role of the guilty party without a fight. His innocence was worth fighting for, and he was going to make sure the truth was heard. The turning point. The trial had already been in session for several long, grueling days. With each passing moment, the tension in the courtroom grew heavier. Liam, who had initially felt small and vulnerable when he first entered the courthouse, now stood with a quiet strength. His parents, Sarah and Mark, sat behind him, their faces etched with a mixture of worry and hope. They had never imagined they would be in this position, watching their son fight against an accusation that had no foundation in reality. But here they were, and they had to hold on to hope. As the defense rested its case and the prosecutor prepared to present his closing arguments, the air in the courtroom seemed to thicken with uncertainty. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, that could change the direction of the trial. Liam had never imagined his life would bring him to a place like this, a place where his future hung in the balance, where the truth felt so fragile, so easily dismissed by those in power. But now, as the clock ticked down to the final moments of the trial, he felt something shift inside him. He couldn't control the outcome. He knew that. But what he could control was his resolve, his refusal to back down, and his belief that justice would eventually prevail. The day began like any other in the courtroom. The air was cold, and the echoes of shuffling feet and murmured conversations filled the space. The jury filed in, taking their seats, their faces unreadable. Liam could sense the weight of their gazes, each one fixed on him as they silently deliberated his fate. Rachel Adams, his defense lawyer, had been relentless in her efforts to unravel the prosecution's case. She had deftly dismantled their arguments piece by piece, exposing the gaps in their narrative and showing that the accusations against Liam were based on assumptions and anger rather than solid evidence. But the prosecutor, a man named Thomas Roberts, had been equally determined. He had fought tooth and nail to present Liam as the villain, painting the picture of a rebellious, reckless child who had deliberately targeted a police officer. The prosecutor's strategy had been to cast doubt on the defense's arguments, to make the jury believe that even the smallest inconsistency in Liam's story was enough to convince them of his guilt. But it wasn't working as smoothly as he had hoped. Now, with the closing arguments approaching, Rachel Adams stood before the jury, ready to make her final appeal. She had carefully crafted every word of her closing statement, knowing that this was her chance to drive home the point that Liam was innocent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Rachel began, her voice calm yet filled with unwavering conviction. "You have heard the facts of this case. You've seen the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. There are no fingerprints, no physical evidence, no solid witnesses to support the claim that Liam Harris is the one who threw that rock. What we have here is an accusation based solely on one man's word, an accusation made in the heat of the moment." She paused for a moment, letting her words sink in. The room was silent, and Liam could feel the eyes of the jury on him, some still skeptical, some unsure. But Rachel's words had planted the seed of doubt. She could feel it in the way the jury was shifting in their seats, their attention rapt. Officer Barnes, a respected member of this community, made a snap judgment when he saw a rock hit his car. And in that moment, he chose to accuse a child, an innocent boy, without taking the time to investigate or consider other possibilities. Rachel continued, "Now, we're not here to disparage Officer Barnes. He has served his community honorably for many years. But in this instance, he made a mistake, and that mistake has led to an innocent boy standing trial for something he did not do." Rachel's voice grew more passionate as she spoke. "Liam Harris is not a criminal. He is a young boy who loves soccer and his friends. He is someone who would never harm another person, let alone damage a police officer's property. And the defense has shown you, time and time again, that there is no evidence to suggest that he did." Liam sat still in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. Rachel's words were like a lifeline. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt like someone was truly fighting for him, someone who believed in him with every ounce of their being. He wanted to believe that everything Rachel was saying was going to work, that the truth would come out and set him free. But there was still a lingering doubt, a fear that no matter how strong the defense was, the prosecutor would find a way to sway the jury. And even if he didn't, would they still convict him despite the lack of evidence? Rachel's closing argument came to a powerful conclusion. In this courtroom, the law is supposed to be about fairness and truth. It is not about making assumptions or rushing to judgment. And today, I ask you to do what is right, to look at the facts, to listen to the testimony, and to deliver a verdict based on the truth. The truth is simple. Liam Harris is innocent, and I ask you, in the name of justice, to find him not guilty." With that, she stepped back, her words hanging in the air. For a long moment, the courtroom remained silent. Even the prosecutor seemed momentarily speechless, his usual confidence shaken. Rachel's argument had been compelling, and the jury could no longer ignore the growing sense of uncertainty that had taken hold of the case. Liam's hope swelled in his chest, but he still knew that it wasn't over yet. The prosecutor, now standing, made his final attempt to sway the jury. He took a step toward them, his voice smooth and practiced as he attempted to discredit Rachel's points. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we cannot ignore the fact that Officer Barnes saw the defendant at the scene. We cannot ignore that the damage to his car is clear and undeniable. There may be no physical evidence, but we cannot disregard the fact that a crime was committed. and in the absence of any other credible suspect, the defendant remains the most likely person to have caused the damage. The prosecutor's words were sharp, designed to create doubt, to remind the jury that sometimes, even without evidence, a conviction could be justified based on circumstantial factors. But it was clear that his argument lacked the strength it once had. Rachel had planted a seed, and the prosecutor's final attempt to solidify the case for conviction only seemed to reinforce the doubts that had already begun to form in the jury's minds. The judge then called for the jury to deliberate. As they filed out of the room, Liam felt like his entire world was on hold. It was an agonizing silence that stretched on for what seemed like hours. He sat still, hardly able to move, his thoughts swirling. Had he done enough to convince the jury? Had Rachel's strategy worked, or was it still too late? After what felt like an eternity, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman, stood as the judge called the room to attention. "We have reached a verdict," the judge said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. Liam's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. His future rested on the words that would come next. The foreperson turned to the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Liam Harris, not guilty." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The weight that had been pressing down on Liam's chest for days, for weeks, lifted in an instant. His body felt lighter, his mind clearer. The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and sighs of relief. Liam couldn't believe it. His throat tightened as he fought to hold back tears. He had won. The truth had prevailed. And in that moment, Liam knew that his life was his again. But more importantly, he had learned that no matter how hard the world tried to break him, no matter how impossible it seemed, standing up for the truth was always worth the fight. The aftermath. The sound of the gavel ringing through the courtroom still echoed in Liam's mind long after the verdict had been read. Not guilty. It was the phrase that had saved his future, that had shattered the wall of lies that had been constructed around him. The weight that had pressed so heavily on his chest for weeks had finally lifted. The years ahead of him, once uncertain and marred by an accusation that had been entirely false, now seemed possible again. But while the courtroom had given him the freedom he so desperately craved, it would take much more than a verdict to heal the wounds that had been inflicted on him and his family. As the crowd slowly filtered out of the courtroom, Liam sat still for a few moments, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes were still fixed on the judge's empty seat, as if he were waiting for something, anything, to change. But nothing did. His mind was racing, replaying the trial in flashes, each part more surreal than the last. The prosecutor's words, the sting of Officer Barnes' accusation, the weight of the gavel, it was all a blur. Rachel Adams stood beside him, her calm demeanor unchanged despite the emotional weight of the case. "You did it, Liam. You're free," she said, her voice soft but sincere. The victory wasn't just hers. It was his, and she knew that the path had been long and full of challenges, but they had made it through together. Liam nodded, but he felt distant. The courtroom might have freed him from the charge, but the emotional scars, the tension, the shame, it wasn't something that could be wiped away with a verdict. It wasn't just the community's view that troubled him. It was the damage to his self-confidence, his trust in the world around him. How could he go back to normal after this? How could he ever look at the people in his neighborhood, or even his school, the same way? Sarah, his mother, wrapped her arms around him as soon as he stepped out of the courtroom, her tears flowing freely. She hadn't stopped crying for days. Mark, his father, stood by her side, his expression a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It was clear they had been through the emotional ringer, and now they could finally breathe again. But Liam noticed the way they looked at him. Proud, yes, but there was a hesitancy too. How could they help him rebuild the trust he'd lost in the world? They didn't know how to fix it. How could they? The accusation had been so public. The damage to Liam's reputation wasn't something a simple not guilty verdict could erase. It wasn't just the neighborhood's perception, but the entire ordeal had ripped apart the sense of safety he had once felt. He wasn't just accused of something he didn't do. He had been punished in the eyes of the world for something that had been beyond his control. For weeks, the case had dominated every conversation in their town. It wasn't just an accusation against a random boy. It had been an accusation against a police officer. The community, having placed their trust in Officer Barnes, had found it difficult to believe that their own could make such a mistake. But now, they would have to reckon with the truth. Officer Barnes had been wrong, and the system had failed to protect a young boy from the consequences of that mistake. It was as if the town itself was divided into two camps, those who believed in the boy's innocence and those who were too loyal to the police to accept the truth. The media had spread the story far and wide. Liam had heard whispers and snide remarks even as he walked to school, even after the verdict. People didn't know him anymore. They saw the boy who had been accused, not the boy who had won the fight for his life. But despite the heaviness of it all, there was a quiet strength beginning to grow within Liam. He knew the battle was far from over. The truth had won in the courtroom, but in life, things were rarely so simple. As the family walked out of the courthouse together, Liam felt a pang of nervousness. It wasn't the trial that frightened him now. It was the aftermath. The challenge of returning to his life and rebuilding the trust that had been broken. That night, when they arrived home, Sarah cooked Liam's favorite meal, spaghetti and meatballs. It wasn't much, but it was a small gesture to bring some normalcy back. Mark sat beside him at the table, clapping him on the back and praising him for his strength throughout the entire ordeal. "You showed them, Liam," Mark said with a proud grin. "You stood up for yourself and never gave up. You should be proud of yourselves, son." Liam nodded, his gaze drifting to the table. It felt good to hear his father's words, but there was a part of him that still couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in his own life. He could hear his friends laughing and playing outside, and part of him wanted to join them. But another part of him felt the distance, the fear of judgment, the fear that things would never be the same again. The next day, as Liam walked to school, he felt like every pair of eyes was on him. Whispers followed him as he entered the school gates. He had always been a relatively popular kid, well-liked and easygoing. But now, everything had changed. No one seemed to know what to say to him. His teachers gave him sympathetic smiles, but there was an air of awkwardness in every conversation. Even his friends, those who had always had his back, seemed unsure of how to act. They'd heard the rumors, the stories, and now they saw him differently. They didn't know whether to congratulate him for being found innocent or to offer apologies for being hesitant when the accusations were first made. Liam had always prided himself on his ability to make friends easily, but now it felt like his identity had been stolen. Who was he if he wasn't just the boy who played soccer in the street or had easygoing conversations with his classmates? For the first time in his life, Liam felt like he was living in the shadow of something he couldn't escape. During lunch that day, Liam sat at the table with a few of his closest friends. They tried their best to make him feel comfortable, but the silence between them was palpable. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know how to help. They didn't know how to make things right when the world had turned upside down in such a public, unforgiving way. "Liam, we believe you, man," Jake said after a long pause. Jake was one of the few who had stood up for him during the trial. Even when things looked bleak, Jake had believed in him. He had spoken out in court, telling the jury what he had seen. "We all know you didn't do it." Liam looked at his friend, his heart swelling with gratitude. But Jake's words didn't take away the sting of the last few weeks. "I know, Jake. It's just, I don't know how to feel about everything anymore. It's like everyone sees me as that kid who was accused. Even if they know I didn't do it, the damage is already done." Jake sat back in his chair, nodding slowly. He didn't have the answers. None of them did. They were all just trying to figure out how to make things feel normal again. But sometimes, after something like this, normalcy was the last thing that came back. That afternoon, Liam walked home in silence, the world feeling heavier than ever. He had won the battle in court, but in his heart, he knew that the true victory would come when he could look at his reflection and see himself again, without the weight of the false accusation, without the shame, without the fear. And so, as the days wore on, Liam made a promise to himself. He would rebuild his life. He would make new friends, regain the trust he had lost, and most importantly, he would remind himself that one false accusation would not define him. The road ahead might be hard, but he had already proven to himself that he was stronger than the lies. Now he just had to learn how to believe in that strength every day. Rebuilding and rediscovery. The days following the trial were a delicate dance between healing and confronting the wounds left by the ordeal. For Liam, the journey ahead was far from simple. He had been granted his freedom, but the shadows of the accusation still loomed large, casting doubts on the very foundation of his life. In the courtroom, the truth had triumphed, but in the world outside, things felt infinitely more complicated. He was free from the weight of the charges, but how could he move forward when the stain of that false accusation was still fresh in the minds of those around him? Each morning, as he prepared for school, Liam found it harder to muster the same enthusiasm he once had. The once carefree walk to school now felt like a journey through a fog of uncertainty. The quiet whispers and sideways glances from his classmates were impossible to ignore. He could feel their eyes on him, even when they tried to hide it behind their books or their phones. It wasn't the outright judgment that hurt the most. It was the uncertainty, the way people seemed unsure of how to treat him. Some offered polite smiles, while others avoided him altogether, unsure of whether to congratulate him on his victory or to feel awkward about the accusations that had surrounded him. At home, things were quieter than usual. His parents, Sarah and Mark, had become more protective, as though they were afraid of him facing the world alone. It was as if they too were walking on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate the new reality they all found themselves in. They made an effort to keep the home warm and comforting, but they knew that this wasn't something that could easily be fixed with a home-cooked meal or a heart-to-heart conversation. Liam's mother, Sarah, often took him aside, trying to reassure him in small ways. "You're still the same boy you were before this all happened," she would say, brushing a strand of hair out of his face. "Nothing can take away who you are inside." She tried to remind him of the values they had taught him over the years: honesty, integrity, and perseverance. But as comforting as her words were, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that he had been irreparably changed by everything that had happened. The boy who had once found joy in the simple act of kicking the soccer ball now looked at the world through a lens of suspicion and wariness. At school, the first few weeks after the trial were the hardest. He walked into the hallways with his head slightly lowered, avoiding eye contact with the students who used to be his friends. They had all heard the story, of course. The headlines in the local paper had covered every detail of his arrest and the subsequent trial. While some of them believed in his innocence, others hadn't been so sure. After all, an accusation from a police officer carried a certain weight, one that made it difficult for people to easily let go of. Liam's friends, Jake and a few others, continued to support him, but there was an unspoken barrier now between them, something neither side could quite name. They didn't want to seem like they were treating him differently, but the awkwardness in their interactions was undeniable. They were trying, but it was clear that no matter how hard they tried to show they believed in him, something had shifted. One afternoon, Liam found himself sitting alone in the school courtyard, trying to make sense of everything. He watched as the other kids mingled, talking and laughing, while he felt like an outsider looking in. His hands rested on his knees, and he stared at the grass beneath him, lost in his thoughts. It was during these moments of solitude that he began to realize just how deep the wound from the accusation ran. It wasn't just the way people looked at him. It was the way he began to look at himself. The confidence he once carried with ease was now replaced with uncertainty. Who was he now? Was he the boy they had accused, Or was he the person who had fought for the truth? And more importantly, how could he rebuild the pieces of himself that felt shattered? It wasn't until one afternoon, when Jake invited him to play soccer again, that Liam began to see a way forward. It was a simple gesture, an invitation to return to something familiar, to do something that had once been a source of joy. But even the thought of it felt strange now. "Come on, Liam," Jake said, tossing him the soccer ball. "You used to love this. We'll just mess around, no pressure. It'll be fun." Liam hesitated at first. He hadn't kicked a soccer ball since the day of the accusation. The game, once a way to bond with friends, had now become a painful reminder of everything he had lost. But when he looked at Jake's hopeful expression, something stirred within him, a small spark of the old Liam who found comfort in the game. So, with a deep breath, Liam took the ball and kicked it across the field. The first few minutes were awkward, but gradually, the rhythm returned. His feet moved in familiar patterns, his body recalling the motions from before. He began to lose himself in the game, laughing at the occasional clumsy misstep, feeling the weight of the past few weeks start to lift, if only for a moment. For the first time since the trial, Liam began to feel like himself again, and he realized that this small act, playing soccer, just like he used to, was a step toward rediscovering who he was before all the chaos. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about reclaiming the parts of his life that had been taken from him. With every pass, every kick, every goal, he felt like he was rebuilding something deep inside, a sense of confidence that had been shaken but not destroyed. As the weeks went on, Liam began to make gradual progress in reconnecting with his old friends. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of awkwardness, but he took solace in the fact that some people were still willing to meet him where he was, to see beyond the accusations and the media stories. Slowly but surely, he started to regain the trust that had been lost, both from others and from himself. One day, as Liam walked through the school halls, he felt a shift. The whispers that had once followed him now seemed to quiet. People who had avoided him before now greeted him with genuine smiles, and the weight of their judgment seemed to lift. It wasn't that they had all suddenly forgotten about the trial. It was more that they had come to terms with it, and they had accepted him again. There was no more shame in his name, and the world seemed to be offering him a chance to rebuild. Even Officer Barnes, who had once been the source of Liam's darkest days, was no longer an intimidating figure in the background. The officer, although still a respected member of the force, had become a symbol of something far more complex. To Liam, Barnes represented both the system that had failed him and the painful lesson that no one, no matter how trusted or well-intentioned, was infallible. Through it all, Liam began to understand something important. Healing didn't come from winning the trial, and it didn't come from the validation of others. Healing came from within. It came from the small steps forward, the moments when he chose to push past the pain and allow himself to be the person he wanted to be, not defined by the trial, but by his resilience, his ability to rise above, and his commitment to truth and self-acceptance. Liam was beginning to understand that life didn't stop just because you were wronged. No matter how much you tried to control things, you couldn't predict the way life would unfold. All he could do now was face forward, step by step, and rebuild his future from the ashes of the past. New beginnings and the power of forgiveness. The months following the trial passed more quickly than Liam had expected. Each day felt like a new opportunity to prove to himself that he could rise above the shadow of the false accusations that had so nearly stolen his future. His life was slowly starting to resemble something familiar again, but there were still moments when he caught himself second-guessing his every action, his every word. Had the world truly forgiven him, or was he simply pretending everything had gone back to normal? One thing was certain. Liam had learned a profound lesson through the entire ordeal. The power of resilience was something he could never have fully appreciated before. He had been knocked down, dragged through the mud by lies and deceit, but he hadn't stayed there. He had found a way to stand up again, to rebuild, and to reclaim the parts of himself that had been buried under the weight of the accusations. The community, too, had begun to heal. The whispers that had once followed him now seemed quieter, and people began to see him for who he was, not for the rumors that had clouded his name. Friends who had distanced themselves started to reach out, unsure of how to break the ice, but eager to return to the way things used to be. Slowly, the awkwardness began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of trust, though it was clear that things would never be quite the same. But perhaps that wasn't a bad thing. The people who truly mattered in Liam's life, the ones who had never doubted him, who had believed in him when the world turned its back, had become his rock. His family, especially his mother Sarah, had been his unwavering support throughout the entire ordeal. And Jake, his best friend, had been a constant source of comfort and encouragement. Jake had stood by him from the very beginning, had spoken out when others remained silent, and had never wavered in his belief that Liam was innocent. Their friendship had deepened in ways Liam hadn't imagined, and he realized that the experience, as painful as it had been, had also strengthened the bonds that mattered most. Yet, despite the progress he had made in reclaiming his life, one final challenge remained. He had to face the man who had set the events in motion, the man who had accused him, without evidence, and had put his family through the most terrifying months of their lives. Officer Raymond Barnes. Liam had spent countless sleepless nights wondering what he would say if he ever saw Officer Barnes again. The officer was a man who had once been seen as a pillar of the community, someone people trusted and respected. And yet that trust had been broken in the most profound way. Barnes had ruined Liam's life with one accusation, and it had taken a courtroom full of people and an emotional roller coaster for Liam and his family to prove that he was innocent. Liam couldn't help but feel the anger welling up inside him whenever he thought of Barnes. The officer had never apologized, never acknowledged the harm he had caused. And yet, as Liam spent more time reflecting on the trial and its aftermath, he began to realize something profound. The anger, the resentment, it was only holding him back. It was preventing him from fully moving forward, from fully healing. One afternoon, a few months after the trial, Liam and Jake were sitting together at their favorite spot in the park, watching the sunset and tossing a soccer ball back and forth. The weather was warm, and the park was filled with families enjoying the last rays of daylight. There was a sense of peace in the air, something that Liam hadn't felt in a long time. The world around him had finally stopped feeling so heavy. Jake looked over at Liam, and as though sensing the thoughts that had been swirling in his mind for weeks, spoke up. "You've been awfully quiet lately, man. You doing all right?" Liam sighed deeply, feeling the weight of his thoughts settling in his chest. "I'm fine, Jake. Really. I've been thinking about something." Jake raised an eyebrow, a look of concern on his face. "About what?" "It's about Officer Barnes," Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not angry anymore. I still feel like what he did was wrong. But I don't want to hold on to the anger anymore. It's just eating at me, you know." Jake nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I get it, man. It's tough, but you've got to let it go, for your own sake. Holding on to it just keeps you in that same place of hurt." Liam glanced down at the ground, nodding as he processed his friend's words. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how true they were. He had been clinging to the anger, letting it cloud his judgment, when in reality, it was only keeping him from moving forward. He didn't need Officer Barnes to apologize. He didn't need him to come and beg for forgiveness. What Liam needed, more than anything, was to forgive himself for holding on to the past, for letting the injustice control his emotions for so long. It was in that moment, as the last golden rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, that Liam made a choice. He wasn't going to let the past define him any longer. He wasn't going to let one man's mistake, one that had shattered his world for a while, hold him back from the future he wanted to build. Over the next few days, Liam's resolve grew stronger. He began to let go of the resentment, bit by bit. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the memories would come rushing back. The fear, the confusion, the helplessness. But he began to realize that letting go didn't mean forgetting. It didn't mean excusing the wrong that had been done to him. It simply meant choosing to move forward. Choosing peace. Choosing his own happiness over the poison of anger. One morning, about a week later, Liam found himself standing in front of the Maple Ridge police station. He had thought about this moment over and over again, rehearsed what he would say. But now that he was standing there, he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The front desk officer looked up at him, and after a moment's hesitation, Liam spoke. "Is Officer Barnes here?" The officer raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you want to speak to him?" Liam nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, I do." After a few moments of silence, the officer stood up and walked down the hallway, returning shortly with Officer Barnes. The man's face was still stern, his uniform crisp and clean, but there was something different about him. He seemed vulnerable. Liam felt a rush of emotions flood through him. Anger, confusion, even sadness, but he pushed them aside. "Liam," Officer Barnes said, his voice low. "I never thought I'd see you here." Liam stared at him for a moment before speaking. "I didn't come here for an apology, Officer Barnes. I didn't come here to ask you to make things right. I came here because I need to forgive you. I need to move on with my life. And I can't do that if I'm still holding on to what you did to me." The officer looked at him, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You're forgiving me?" Liam nodded slowly. "Yes, it wasn't easy, and I'm still trying to figure out how to move forward. But I'm choosing to let go of the anger. I'm choosing to heal." There was a long silence between them, and for the first time, Liam saw a crack in Officer Barnes' stoic facade. The officer nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I'm sorry, Liam. I truly am. I can't change the past, but I can respect what you've chosen to do." Liam took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in months. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I think that's all I needed to hear." As Liam walked out of the station, he felt a sense of finality settle within him. The past was still there, a part of his story, but it no longer held him captive. He had forgiven not just Officer Barnes, but himself as well. And with that forgiveness came the freedom to rebuild, to move forward, and to embrace the future. For the first time in a long time, Liam felt at peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he knew that whatever came next, he was ready. The battle had been hard, but it had made him stronger, more resilient, and more determined than ever to live his life on his terms. And that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.